In this video, we're breaking down 5 of the legendary Mikhail Botvinnik's most impressive games in the English Opening, showcasing his strategic depth and innovative approach. The first challenger is the renowned Grandmaster Paul Keres. Botvinnik starts with, as expected, c4, the English Opening. This opening fights for the center by staking a claim to the d5 square. Although many lines of the English have a distinct character, this opening often transposes into other openings and is considered a flexible way to start the game. Black replies knight f6, hitting the center, and white fights back with knight c3. Then e5 is played, marking a reverse Sicilian. White attacks the pawn with knight f3, and black defends with knight c6. After white plays g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop, black's bishop is developed to c5, pressuring f2. Botvinnik cleverly captures the pawn on e5, making use of the fact that black recapturing would put the knight and bishop in the ideal formation to be forked by the d-pawn. So black plays the desperado, bishop takes f2, giving up his bishop since he was going to lose it anyway, to force white's king into a precarious position. Then black regains the piece, capturing the knight on e5. In the aftermath, white pushes his e4 pawn, making strides in the center, and black does the same with c5, hitting the frail d4 square. White's d3 supports his central pawns, and black follows suit with d6. Botvinnik's h3 prevents black's minor pieces from landing on g4, and black replies with the aggressive h5, gaining space on the king side. White's bishop e2 creates a battery aimed at the h5 pawn, and black replies with an interesting move. Knight h7. The idea is to reroute the knight forward, and if the bishop took the pawn on h5, then the knight would instead go right back to f6, attacking the bishop twice. Once the bishop moves back, then the bishop on c8 could capture the pawn on h3 as supported by the rook on the open h-file. So white prudently shifts his king to g2 away from the center to support his kingside pawns. Black immediately pushes his h-pawn to open up the king side, and also so that white cannot play h4 himself to stop the black knight from going to g5. White wisely keeps things closed with g4, and the black knight hops to a powerful post on g5. With his king safety situation, for the most part, resolved, Botvinnik finishes up his development with bishop e3. Black develops his bishop to d7, and white plays queen d2, creating a battery aimed at the knight. Black could play f6 to defend, but decides to move the knight back to e6, eyeing up some juicy squares in white's camp. White does not like this, so he breaks with b4 in an attempt to eliminate black's influential c-pawn. Black keeps things sturdy with b6 supporting the pawn, and white shifts his rook from a to b1 as the b-file will inevitably open up. Then black moves his bishop to c6, indirectly hitting the king across the long diagonal. There is no threat just yet, so Botvinnik slides his rook over to the semi-open f-file. Black's next plan is to land a knight uncontested onto the d4 square. He first drops his bishop back to b7, opening up the square for the knight to maneuver to d4. White cautiously moves his king back to g1, and black moves the knight to c6. White, in similar fashion, leaps his knight onto d5, and black places his knight onto d4. Now, with the majority of white's pawns on light squares, he does not want to give up his good dark-squared bishop for the knight. He also saves his other bishop with bishop d1. Likewise, with black's pawns on dark squares, he does not want to give up his light-squared bishop for the knight, and instead plays f6, diminishing the white rook's power along the f-file. Now in the future, there's a chance that the g-file could open up, so Botvinnik moves his king to h2 so that one of his rooks could land on g1. In view of white's potential bishop a4 check, which would be difficult to meet, black plays bishop c6 covering the diagonal. Then white pushes a4, gaining ground on the queen side. Black stops further expansion with a5, but white just takes the pawn. Black shouldn't recapture with his rook because the b-pawn would be hanging, so he recaptures with the pawn, giving white control of the open b-file. White slides his queen to f2, creating a battery on the f-file and attacking h4. Now g4 is coming, and the king side will completely open up. In light of this, black lifts his rook to a7 so that it can defend the kingside laterally. With the tension of an impending attack hanging heavily in the air, Botvinnik, with a strategist calm, decisively plays g5, gaining the upper hand. Now white has 4 attackers on the f6 pawn and black only 2 defenders. But black deviously castles into the oncoming storm. He sees that if white were to take on f6, the pawn would be pinned to the queen, so black would have time to first take the knight on d5, removing 1 attacker of the f6 pawn, then he would recapture the pawn with the rook, hitting the queen and forcing some exchanges. In addition, white could also take the hanging pawn on h4, but black would just take on g5, and what would follow is an exchange of several pieces, and white may have won a pawn, but there just isn't an attack anymore. Botvinnik does neither of those things. He pushes g6, locking up the helpless king. Now he will take on h4 with the threat of checkmate. So black pushes f5, opening up the queen's defense of the pawn and threatening to take on e4, forcing some exchanges. And this would have been a way out for black, if not for one and only one move. Can you find the winning move for white? The move that Botvinnik plays is, incredibly, rook b8. His opponent falls back in his chair, exhaling sharply in utter disbelief before reaching out for a handshake, signaling his resignation. Black's queen, under attack, has no safe place to go while still defending the pawn on h4. And if black were to take the rook, then white would take the pawn on h4 with an unstoppable checkmate to follow. While queen b2 check appears intimidating, white would just dodge the check and there's nothing more black could do. The next opponent is Master Rudolf Spielman, and he meets the English opening with c6. Botvinnik replies e4, and after d5, he captures with his e-pawn. Black recaptures and white plays d4, transposing into an opening named after its player, the Panov-Botvinnik attack of the Karo-Khan defense. Funnily enough, Botvinnik rarely played e4 on his first move, so it was through the English opening that he reached this position in the Karo-Khan defense. Black carries on with knight f6, supporting the center, and white plays knight c3, adding pressure to the d5 pawn. After black's knight c6, white plays bishop g5, threatening to take the knight and win the central pawn. Now black should play a safe move like e6, but he decides to get aggressive with queen b6, adding an attacker to d4 and threatening the pawn on b2. Botvinnik, as brave as a bullfighter, captures the pawn on d5, letting his opponent capture on b2, walking right into an elaborate ruse. White does not have time to take the knight on c6 because black would capture white's knight with check. So white defends his knight with the rook. Now black must defend his own knight. Going to a5 would walk into queen a4 with a fork, and retreating to b8 would disconnect the rook's defense of the bishop so that knight a4 would open up a double attack on the queen and the bishop. The knight going to d8 would be a little more complicated, but white would take the knight, removing defense of the d7 square before playing bishop b5 check, forcing the bishop to block before he would capture it, leaving black's king stuck in the center. White would continue with moves like knight g to e2, castling, and queen a4 with a decisive attack to follow. This is all while most of black's pieces are on the back rank, doing nothing to help. Back to the game. Black goes for knight b4, attacking the pawn on d5, and this is probably his best option. But Botvinnik plays knight a4, hitting the queen, and it's all over. The queen only has 2 safe squares, and will soon understand that regardless of which she picks, she's just a goner. In this case, she captures the pawn on a2, and white has one winning move here. Can you find it? The move Botvinnik plays is bishop c4, attacking the queen. Black, desperate for a white mistake, counterattacks with bishop g4, hitting white's queen. White calmly blocks it with knight f3. Black's final attempt is capturing the knight, hoping that white would recapture with the queen, as that would hang the knight on a4. Botvinnik, no slouch, captures with the pawn, and black resigns. Now if the queen were to sidestep the attack onto a3, then white would not play rook a1, as black would take the rook, and after white recaptures, play knight c2 with a royal fork. Instead, white would play rook c3, and the queen is completely trapped. The next opponent is Sherbakov, and he meets the English opening with knight f6. Botvinnik develops his knight to c3, and black plays g6, preparing to fianchetto his bishop. White does the same with g3 before both sides develop their bishops on the long diagonal. After black castles, white pushes e4, battling for the center, especially the d5 square. White plays d6, opening up his bishop, and white develops his knight from g to e2, staying out of the way of the f-pawn. Black plays e5, fighting for the center, and white castles. Black's knight b to d7 developing is followed by d3, solidifying the white center, before black jumps forward with knight c5. At this moment, Botvinnik breaks with f4. Black avoids capturing the pawn as white would gain a dominant position in the center. So he plays c6, preventing white's knight from landing on d5. White continues with h3, not only stopping black's minor pieces from landing on g4, but preparing to play g4 himself. After black plays knight e6, looking to maneuver onto d4, white gains substantial space with f5 hitting the knight. Taking the pawn would be akin to playing with fire, as the black kingside would completely open up. So black moves the knight to d4, and white pushes g4, fastening his f-pawn into place. Now black does not want to allow white to push g5 with tempo, because it would be followed with f6, completely locking up black's bishop. So he retreats the knight so that he could meet g5 by winning the pawn on f5. Botvinnik proceeds development with bishop e3, and black plays a6, preparing to fight back on the queen side. White's queen d2 creates a battery aimed at the king side, and black immediately breaks with b5. Then white sends his bishop to g5, attacking the queen, and black, noticing that most of white's pawns are on light squares, does not mind trading his fianchettoed bishop for white's strong dark squared bishop. White, also satisfied with the exchange as it removes one of the king's defenders, captures the bishop, and the black knight recaptures, escaping the back rank. Botvinnik follows with knight takes e4, eliminating black's best piece. After the recapture, he plays knight e2, not only attacking the pawn, but looking to reroute towards the king's side in order to bolster the attack. Black plays queen b6, defending his pawn, and white captures on b5, clarifying the situation as black recaptures with his a-pawn, opening the a-file. White launches his queen to h6, and his assault is almost complete. Black is helpless. There just isn't a way to stop the brutal g5. He develops his bishop to d7, and black pushes the g-pawn, attacking the knight, who runs to h5. Botvinnik leaps his knight to f4 in an attempt to remove the black king's final defender. And black should not take the knight, as it would only streamline the attack, and letting white capture the knight would shatter the black kingside. So he retreats the knight to g7. White's next move will kickstart his checkmating combination. Can you find white's winning move? The move that Botvinnik plays is f6, attacking the knight and setting up a lobster pincer checkmate. Black, with no way of stopping his grim fate, resigns the game. Now if the knight moves forward, then it will just be picked off, and white will play checkmate on g7 next. The knight could try retreating to e8, but here's where Botvinnik's brilliance shines. He would play knight d5, threatening knight to e7 check, forcing the king into the corner, after which he would play queen takes f8 checkmate. So black would be forced to take the sacrificed knight, and with the piece out of the way, the white rook would leap to f4, and there's just no way to stop the threat of rook h4 and queen takes h7 checkmate. The penultimate opponent is master Mikhail Yudovich, and he meets the English opening with knight f6. White takes control of the center with d4, transposing into a queen's gambit, and black plays g6, preparing to fianchetto his bishop. After knight c3, black plays d5, challenging white's center. White develops his knight to f3, and black puts his bishop on the long diagonal. Then white plays queen b3, adding an attacker to the d5 pawn. So black plays c6, defending. White captures the pawn, relieving the tension, and black decides to recapture with his knight, keeping the d file open so that he can pressure white's pawn on d4. White develops his bishop to d2, preparing to recapture his knight with it, and black castles. Botvinnik thrusts forward in the center with e4 hitting the knight, who does not capture but retreats to b6. Then white moves his rook to d1, indirectly supporting his pawn on d4. If black were to take the pawn, then the knight would recapture, luring the queen onto d4, where it's susceptible to discovered attacks. Black develops his knight from 8 to d7, and white pushes a4, looking to trap the black knight. So black plays a5, stopping that. White moves his bishop to a more active square on e3 while opening up his rook's eyes. Black's queen c7 is followed by bishop e2, preparing to castle. Black continues queen d6 with the idea of going to b4 in hopes of exchanging queens. This would benefit him as the side with less space. Botvinnik does not give his opponent any chances, playing knight a2 to stop queen b4. Black plays e6, gaining a firm grip over the d5 square and stopping white from pushing d5 as his d-pawn is slightly weak. White castles, and black follows with h6, giving his king some air. White moves his rook to the semi-open c-file before black tries to break free with f5. White wants to preserve his central pawn duo, so he does not capture. He returns his knight to c3 so that if black were to take, he could at least centralize his knight with tempo. Black gets his king away from the white queen's leering eyes, and white plays rook f to d1, activating his final piece. After black takes the pawn on e4, white recaptures with his knight, attacking the queen, who jumps to b4, begging for an exchange. Botvinnik calmly ducks the exchange, going to c2 where it sets its sights on the enemy king. But this allows black to win the pawn on a4 while attacking the queen. White blocks it with b3, and the queen goes to its only available square on a3. Then white plays knight h4, and the winning combination is just about ready to unveil. Black retreats his queen to e7 to assist his vulnerable king, but it's too little too late. White grabs the pawn on g6, sacrificing his knight with an attack on the queen and the rook. If black doesn't take the knight, then he would just be down material. So he takes it, giving white an amazing move to win the game. Can you find it? The move that Botvinnik plays is bishop h5 check, sacrificing a second piece, and the black resigns. The king only has 3 options. King f5 would result in g4 checkmate. Fleeing to h7 would run into knight f6 with a double check, which would force king to g8, then the queen could hop into h7 with checkmate. Finally, if black were to take the bishop, then he would walk right into the hands of the knight as it would leap to g3. It wouldn't matter where the king would go next, queen to e4 check would follow, and black's only defense would be rook f4, which would be captured by the queen, who would be giving checkmate. If you made it this far, then you're in for a treat, because this final game is just brilliant. Grandmaster Lajos Portisch meets the English opening with e5. Botvinnik develops his knight to c3 and black develops his to f6. Then white plays g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop, and black thrusts forward in the center with d5. White takes the pawn, creating an open center, and black recaptures with the knight. White's bishop g2 adds an attacker to the knight, so black defends it with bishop e6. White jumps his knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn, and again black defends with knight c6, before white castles his king to safety. Now white may want to play d4, opening up his bishop and the center while the king is still a couple moves away from castling. So black retreats his knight to b6, opening up his queen's eyes to prevent d4. Botvinnik settles for d3, and black plays bishop e7, preparing to castle. White's a3 prepares a potential expansion on the queen side, and black puts a halt to those plans immediately with a5. a5, however, slightly weakens the queenside pawns as they are a little disconnected. So white puts his bishop on e3, and after black castles, he moves his knight to a4 to remove a defender of the black queenside. Now black does not have to trade, but he decides to take the knight, and after white recaptures with the queen, black's bishop d5 trying to contest the long diagonal is followed by rook a to c1, adding pressure down the c-file. Black moves his rook to e8 with the idea of pushing down the e-file, and white lifts his rook to c2, preparing to double rooks. After black moves his bishop to f8, opening up his rook's eyes, white doubles the rooks along the c-file. Then black returns his knight to b8 to maneuver it to f6, and setting a trap for white. Or so it seems. The c-pawn is hanging, and Botvinnik, without an ounce of fear, grabs it instantly. The trap that black thinks he has is bishop c6, disconnecting the rooks. White captures the bishop, shocking everybody. After black takes back, white has an incredible move to win the game. Can you find it? With black's light-squared bishop, the defender of the light squares, removed, Botvinnik stunningly sacrifices his second rook, capturing the pawn on f7. If black were to accept the sacrifice, then white would move his queen to c4 with check. Black wouldn't be able to block, because knight to g5 would check, opening up a discovered attack on the queen. Also, going towards the center would just invite trouble after knight takes e5, which would threaten the unstoppable queen f7 check. Afterwards, moves like bishop g5, bishop b6, and bishop h3 would be decisive. Black's best bet would be to go to g6. Then white would play queen e4 check. King f6 would result in bishop g5, so the king would be forced back to f7, and after knight g5 check, black's only option would be to sacrifice the queen for the knight, as going to g8 would lead to checkmate, and we already know that going towards the center would be a bad idea for black. Back to the game. In light of these lines, black does not take the rook, instead playing h6 to prevent knight g5. White swings his rook back to b7, having gotten 2 pawns and a bishop for the rook, meaning material is even. Black shifts his queen to c8, attacking the rook, and white plays queen c4 check, pushing the king to the corner. Then the knight hops to h4, eyeing up the potent g6 square. But wait a second. The white rook's hanging. Black captures it, and white's knight leaps gloriously onto g6, forcing the king to h7. White plays bishop e4, setting up a discovered check, and black just has no defense. He at the very least saves his bishop from getting captured, moving it to d6. Botvinnik captures the pawn on e5 with check. The king going to h8 would result in knight f7 check, forcing the king onto g8, after which knight to d6 would win the queen. So black plays g6 to block the check. White takes the pawn with his bishop, hitting the king, who slides over to g7. And the final move of this game does not disappoint. Bishop takes h6 check. Black's had enough of Botvinnik's boundless, belligerent sacrifices, and resigns. Black has a few replies here, but they all lose. King h8 would see knight to f7 check, and white would win the queen as we saw earlier. King f6, the worst of the bunch, would be met by queen f4. King e6 would result in bishop f7, followed by queen h4 checkmate. King to e7 would see bishop g5, pushing the king to e6, leading to queen c4, forcing the king to capture on e5, after which queen e4 would be checkmate. Going back, last but not least, if the king were to take the bishop, then white would play queen h4 check, pushing the king to g7. Then queen h7 would skewer the king and queen, winning the queen with an attack on both rooks. White would be up a substantial amount of material. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.